Why was everyone staring? The rotors of the Black Hawk cut the Afghan sky like a blade, whipping dust into her eyes as she stepped off the ramp. Sand stung her face, her lips, her skin. She didn't blink. She just adjusted the straps of the machine. Gun slung across her back, the weight pressing into her spine, the heat of the steel barrel against her shoulder. Staff Sergeant Maria Santis had carried that weight before Iraq, Kuwait, a dozen training ranges where men twice her size had stumbled under its bulk. But here, at Forward Operating Base Coast, it was different. Here, the weight wasn't just steel and ammunition. It was doubt. 50 eyes followed her as she crossed the gravel toward the barracks. Soldiers leaning on Humvees, boots crunching. Arms folded, some smirked, some whispered. A few exchanged crumpled bills. Like gamblers circling a horse race. And at the center of it all, one voice rose above the others. "Wow, wow," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez said, his grin cutting like barbed wire. "Looks like they sent us a girl to do a man's job." Laughter followed. It was sharp, nervous, eager to belong. The kind of laughter that young soldiers used to hide their own fear. She caught the voice of a private, maybe 19, throwing money into a pool. "I'll take that action," bet she drops it before the first click. Maria didn't answer. She didn't need to. 8 years in the Army had taught her silence was sharper than any retort. She let their words hang in the dust-choked air, memorizing their faces one by one. They weren't betting on her strength. They were betting on her failure. And failure, in a place like this, could get them all killed. Rodriguez stepped forward until she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. His eyes had the weary hardness of a man who'd seen too much war and trusted too few people. He gestured at the M249 on her back. $50 says you can't carry that pig more than 2 clicks without crying for help." More laughter, more money, more doubt. Maria unslung the weapon, the motion fluid, practiced, almost ceremonial. She ran her hands over its frame, checked the feed tray, locked the bipod. She'd done this in the dark, in sandstorms, in the back of helicopters rattling over deserts. The M249 wasn't a weight to her. It was an extension of her. Her voice was calm, steady. When she finally answered him, "Make it 100. The crowd erupted. Surprise, mockery, excitement. Even Rodriguez looked taken aback before he clasped her hand and sealed the bet. 2 kilometers. Full load. No breaks. Tomorrow at dawn. She walked away without another word. Boots grinding against the gravel. The whispers burning into her back. Every soldier she passed was waiting to see her fail. To them, she wasn't a machine gunner. She wasn't a veteran with 2 deployments. She was a liability with long hair tied back under a helmet. That night, when others crowded into the rec room, she slipped into the dark behind the barracks. The Afghan night was cool, sharp, almost kind compared to the daytime heat. She strapped the M249 to her back, adjusted the body armor until it bit into her shoulders, and began to move. Burpees, bear crawls, push-ups with her boots balanced on ammunition crates. Sweat dripped into the dust until it became mud beneath her hands. Each rep wasn't just for tomorrow. It was for every firefight that hadn't happened yet. Because the real test wasn't 2 kilometers. The real test was survival. At 0545 the next morning, she stood at the motor pool. The horizon was just beginning to pale. The jagged ridges of Afghanistan etched black against the sky. She adjusted her chin strap, the machine gun snug across her back, the armor cinched tight across her chest. The crowd had grown. Not just her squad, not just Rodriguez. Half the base had come to watch. Soldiers leaned against Humvees, sipping bitter coffee from paper cups, waiting for the entertainment to begin. 2 clicks, Rodriguez announced. No help, no breaks. He smirked at her again, but this time his eyes were searching, curious. Lead the way, Sergeant. Maria said. The first kilometer was nothing. Her breathing steady, her pace controlled. Rodriguez kept glancing at her, waiting for signs of strain, but she didn't falter. The murmurs behind them shifted, some laughing, others silent. The young Private Thompson muttered about her slowing soon. Maria caught his voice and stored it away. At the halfway point, she allowed herself a small smile. Rodriguez saw it. His smirk flickered, replaced by something almost like respect. And then the radio on his vest crackled. Bravo 26, this is TOC. Medical convoy requests immediate escort to Cop Wilderness. Taliban activity reported along Route Falcon. The march ended in an instant. Rodriguez barked into the handset, his tone snapping from smug to steel. Engines roared as Humvees repositioned. Soldiers scrambled to their vehicles. Rodriguez turned to her. Hope you're not too tired from your morning jog. Maria just pulled the M249 from her back, checked the feed tray, and mounted it on the Humvee's turret. 10 minutes later, they were rolling out of the gate. The convoy stretched through the valley. 3 armored ambulances carrying crates of blood, antibiotics, surgical tools, supplies. That meant the difference between a soldier living or bleeding out on a cot. Maria's Humvee took point. The morning sun washed the mountains in gold, the kind of beauty that never fooled her. Valleys like these were ambush country. She scanned the ridgelines, her optics searching for movement, a glint of metal, a shadow where none should be. She felt it before she saw it, a wrongness in the air. Rodriguez, she called down. 2 o'clock, tree line, too quiet. He raised his binoculars, frowned. I don't see anything. Birds, Maria said, her voice tight. There should be birds. The words were barely out of her mouth before the first burst of a K-fire cracked from the trees. The world exploded. Muzzle flashes winked through the foliage. Bullets rattled against armored plates. Dust geysers erupted around the convoy wheels. Rodriguez's voice bellowed over the radio. Contact, 300 meters. Maria swung the M249 toward the tree line and opened fire. The weapon bucked, brass casings clattering against the turret. She saw a fighter drop, another muzzle flash silenced, but then, horror. The deeper machine gun, the convoy's anchor, fell silent. She looked back just in time to see Specialist Davis slumped forward in his turret, blood staining his uniform, his M240 jammed. Useless. The convoy was exposed. No suppressive fire meant no protection. The ambulances carrying life-saving supplies were sitting ducks. Maria didn't think, she acted. She grabbed the M249, vaulted from her turret, and sprinted through the kill zone. 30 meters of open ground, bullets snapping past her ears. An RPG screening into a boulder nearby and showering her with stone fragments. She dove into the second Humvee, landing beside Davis. Guns jammed. He gasped. Bolts stuck. She didn't waste a second trying to fix it. Instead, she climbed into the turret and swung her M249 into position. It didn't have the range of the M240. It didn't have the same power, but she had trained for this. Short, controlled bursts, left to right, muzzle flash to muzzle flash. The first target went down. The second ducked into cover. The third, trying to aim at the lead ambulance, collapsed mid-stride. The M249 spat fire and smoke, her controlled bursts walking across the tree line, forcing fighters into cover, shattering their momentum. For 5 minutes, she was the only barrier between the convoy and destruction. And then, silence. The tree line emptied. The ambush broke. The convoy rolled forward, wounded and shaken, but alive. At Cop Wilderness, Rodriguez approached her. He didn't speak. He just pressed a crumpled $100 bill into her palm and walked away. That evening, in the chow hall, the laughter was gone. Private Thompson approached her with his tray, eyes down, voice quiet. I owe you an apology, he muttered. And probably my life. Maria looked up from her plate. Just remember it, she said. The next time someone tells you what a person can or can't do. The bet had been about carrying a weapon, but the real test? It had already begun. Why did the whispers never stop? 3 weeks had passed since the ambush on Route Falcon. 3 weeks since she'd run through a kill zone, shouldered a machine gun not meant for her, and held off a squad of Taliban fighters long enough to save a convoy. 3 weeks since soldiers who had bet against her now nodded in quiet respect when she passed. But respect in war is fragile. It doesn't last. In the chow hall, she could still feel eyes on her back. Some were admiring, some were curious, and some were waiting for her to slip, to prove that maybe the first fight had just been luck. Corporal Williams was the loudest skeptic. He didn't mock her openly the way Rodriguez once had, but his doubts lingered in smaller ways. A comment about her patrol formations, a criticism about the way she cleaned her weapon, a glance exchanged with another soldier when she spoke in briefings. It wasn't the gunfire that made Maria restless at night. It was the silence between her squad mates, the silence of unspoken judgment. The test came one afternoon when Captain Morrison strode into the Tactical Operations Center, a manila folder in his hand. His voice was sharp. "Urgent, actionable intel," he said, slapping aerial photographs onto the table. "I value. Target, Malika Kassim, responsible for the IEDs along Route Falcon, meeting his cell leaders tonight in this compound." The photo showed a mud brick courtyard, high walls, a dark rectangle of shadow in the middle of the mountains. To Morrison, it was a simple mission. Capture or kill. Fast insertion, overwhelming force, clean extraction. To Maria, the photo felt wrong, too quiet, too still. "What's the expected enemy strength?" Rodriguez asked. "Kassim plus 4, maybe 5 guards," Morrison answered. "Standard cell meeting. We insert 2 clicks out by helicopter, approach on foot. Night vision advantage should be decisive." Maria leaned closer to the photos, her finger tracing the outlines of the walls, the blind spots. Something in her gut twisted. She had learned to trust that feeling, the same instinct that had warned her about the too quiet tree line weeks before. "Sir," she said carefully, "are we sure about that intel? The compound layout? It doesn't look like just a meeting spot. Could be something bigger." Morrison's eyes flicked toward her, irritation sharp. "That's classified, Staff Sergeant. Your job is to execute, not question the intelligence." Her voice went quiet. "Yes, sir." But inside, the doubt remained. At 0130 hours, the Black Hawks lifted off. Maria sat at the door. M249 balanced across her knees. Night vision goggles turning the Afghan ridges into alien terrain. Jagged mountains, black rivers of shadow, valleys that had swallowed armies for centuries. The helicopter set down in a clearing, rotors fading until the silence pressed in. 30 soldiers stood in the dust, their boots the only sound. The approach took 45 minutes. Careful, silent, each soldier scanning his sector. The compound loomed ahead, exactly as the photograph had promised. Mud walls, a single gate, no movement inside. The breach was textbook, explosive charges. A thunderclap against the night, dust and smoke pouring upward as first squad surged through the entrance. Maria followed, M249 at the ready, her heart pounding steady in her ears. And then, the mistake revealed itself. Not 5 guards, not a handful of fighters, dozens. The courtyard exploded with muzzle flashes. Doors flew open. Fighters poured from hidden rooms, weapons blazing. 30 Taliban at least. Not a leadership meeting, a training camp. The intelligence had been wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Rodriguez's voice roared over the gunfire. "Contact!" Multiple contacts. The squad scattered for cover. Bullets chewed at the walls, sparks flying off stone. Maria dropped behind a low barrier, her chest hammering. She tried her radio, but static drowned her voice. The thick walls of the compound killing their signal. She was cut off. Through her night vision, she saw the chaos. Soldiers pinned behind corners. Taliban fighters moving in coordinated rushes, trying to flank. Tracers streaked overhead. Green lines of death against the black sky. She needed a better vantage. Her eyes locked on a ladder propped against the main building. A reckless idea, a necessary one. She sprinted, boots pounding across the open courtyard, bullets sparking at her heels. She climbed, the ladder shaking under her weight, and hauled herself onto the rooftop. From up high, the battlefield opened before her. She could see the fighters spilling from doorways, darting between shadows, setting up crew-served weapons. A PKM machine gun appeared in a window, its barrel swinging toward Rodriguez's position. Maria didn't hesitate. She braced her M249, sighted and fired. The gunner dropped. His weapon clattered to the courtyard below. Her voice crackled over the radio. "Rodriguez!" 3 fighters moving along the east wall. Engaging now. She squeezed the trigger. The first fell. The second dove for cover. The third staggered, hit in the leg. Crawling back into shadow, from her rooftop perch, Maria became something else. Not just a soldier in the fight, but the eye in the storm. She called out positions. She laid down suppressive fire. She shifted angles to keep the Taliban guessing, and in the green haze of her goggles, she saw something strange. Fear. Fighters. Hesitating. Men who had trained for ambush, now realizing they were facing something they hadn't expected. Precision. Calm. A voice in the dark that turned the tide. 20 minutes stretched like a lifetime. Then, the sound. The low, thunderous chop of Apache rotors. Thermal imaging lit up the battlefield. Hellfire missiles streaked down, shattering. Strong points, silencing heavy weapons. The courtyard filled with fire and smoke. The Taliban retreating under the steel rain. Maria stayed steady, her fire covering the gaps, until silence finally returned. "Status?" Rodriguez's voice crackled. "Rooftop secure." She answered, her tone flat, her chest heaving. 15 enemy down, no friendlies. When she climbed back down, the courtyard was littered with brass and broken bodies. Her squad was waiting. Faces pale, uniforms torn, eyes wide with exhaustion. Even Corporal Williams, the loudest doubter, looked at her with something close to awe. "I've never seen anything like that," he whispered. Rodriguez clapped her on the shoulder. "That was some of the finest tactical shooting I've seen in 15 years. They loaded the recovered intel into bags, boarded the helicopters, and lifted back into the night sky. On the flight home, Maria sat in silence, the M249 heavy across her lap. Around her, soldiers recounted details of the fight, voices hushed, disbelief still in their tone. Private Thompson leaned toward her, shouting over the roar of the rotors, "Santas! I'm glad you're on our side." She didn't smile. She just checked the chamber of her weapon one more time, her fingers moving with ritual calm. "We're all on the same side," she said. But she knew something had shifted. No more bets. No more whispers. She wasn't just the woman with the heavy weapon anymore. She was the one they had survived beside. Why was the valley so quiet? The convoy rolled along the dirt road at sunrise, engines rumbling, tires grinding through dust that rose like smoke. 50 soldiers, Afghan National Army support, a show of force. Captain Morrison had made that clear. They weren't just clearing an IED staging ground. They were sending a message. But messages can be traps. Maria sat in the lead Humvee, her M249 mounted, optics scanning the ridgelines. The valley stretched for 2 kilometers, steep walls on both sides, slopes that turned the ground below into a killing zone. On paper, it was a tactical sweep. In reality, it was the kind of terrain soldiers feared most. She leaned down to Rodriguez, who was riding below her in the vehicle. "We haven't seen any civilians since we entered the valley. Not a shepherd, not a farmer." Rodriguez's jaw tightened. He had noticed, too. In Afghanistan, silence was a warning. It meant locals had fled, or been told to. The first RPG screamed down from the western ridge. It slammed into the armor of the third vehicle, a fireball lighting the valley floor. Before the echo faded, machine gun nests opened from both ridgelines. A K-fire cracked from hidden positions. Snipers took aim from rocky outcroppings. The ambush had begun. Contact left. Contact right. Rodriguez roared into the radio. The convoy lurched. Drivers swerving for cover that didn't exist. Bullets sparked against metal, ricocheting into the dust. Soldiers scrambled from hatches, returning fire uphill, but the angles were wrong. The enemy had the high ground. Interlocking fields of fire pinned the Americans in place. Within 10 minutes, the fight had turned desperate. An RPG struck the heavy weapons vehicle, killing 2 soldiers instantly and knocking out their M249 machine gun. Afghan National Army troops were caught in the open, their casualties mounting. Captain Morrison's voice rasped through the radio, almost drowned by gunfire. Bravo 6. We are decisively engaged. Company-sized element, request immediate air support. The reply from TOC cut like ice. Air support is 30 minutes out. Artillery on standby, but danger close. 30 minutes. They wouldn't last 10. From her turret, Maria scanned the ridges. Fighters were moving down the slopes, bounding from rock to rock, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The convoy was boxed in, blocked by rock slides at both ends of the valley. The Taliban had planned this perfectly. She keyed her mic, voice low but urgent. Rodriguez, they're maneuvering for a final assault. 10 minutes, maybe less. What do you recommend? His tone was strained, desperate. Her eyes fell on a small rise, a rocky outcrop 50 meters north, high enough to see both ridgelines, exposed, deadly. The kind of position no one wanted because it drew every bullet. But from there, she could suppress both slopes, break the enemy's rhythm, buy time. I need that rise, she said. Negative, Rodriguez snapped. Too exposed. Stay with your vehicle. But she was already moving. She grabbed the M249, belts of ammunition, slung across her shoulders like chains, and vaulted from the Humvee. Bullets cracked around her. An RPG exploded to her left, showering her with rocks. She ran through dust and fire, lungs burning, legs driving her toward the rise. She threw herself behind the rocks, set up her bipod, slammed the first belt into place. All stations. She keyed her mic, her voice sharp, steady. This is Santis. I have eyes on multiple positions. Beginning suppressive fire now. The M249 roared to life. Her first burst cut down a fighter sprinting between boulders. The second ripped through a PKM nest silhouetted against the rising sun. She worked left to right, muzzle flash to muzzle flash, forcing fighters back into cover. For a moment, the battlefield paused, the Taliban realizing they were under fire from an unexpected angle. Then they turned on her. Every weapon, every rifle, every RPG. The rocks around her shattered under impacts. Dirt sprayed into her face. A sniper's round cracked past her head. So close she felt the heat of it. Another RPG streaked toward her position, detonating behind her with a thunderous boom that lifted her off the ground. Shrapnel tore across her cheek. Her ears rang, but she rolled back into position and fired again. Status, Santis? Rodriguez's voice was tight. Engaging 15-plus positions, neutralized 2 PKMs. RPG team suppressed. She swapped belts, her hands moving with mechanical precision, even as her gloves grew slick with sweat and blood. The barrel glowed red, the weapon shaking under sustained fire. She picked targets methodically. The machine guns, the RPG teams, the marksmen. Each burst bought seconds. Seconds her squad needed to move wounded to the center. Seconds medics needed to keep men alive. Seconds the company needed to survive. But time was bleeding out. Her ammo was running low. Each belt was precious now. Every round had to matter. Fighters were pushing closer to 200 meters, 150. She could see their faces, hear their shouts as they hurled grenades down toward the convoy. Air support 15 minutes out. The radio crackled. 15. She didn't have 15. An RPG. slammed into the rocks 10 feet away, the blast knocking her flat. She spat blood, dragged herself back up, and raked a burst across the ridge where the smoke still lingered. The gun bucked, the barrel screaming hot, but she didn't stop. Rodriguez's voice cut in. "Santis, we've got wounded who need evac. Can you suppress those snipers?" She spotted the flashes. 3 positions. She shifted fire, each burst forcing a marksman back. She fired not just to kill, but to buy seconds of movement for medics. Her last belt hung heavy in her hands. 200 rounds, 200 chances to hold back an army. "All stations," she whispered into the mic. "Down to my last belt. They're massing for a final push." "Copy," Rodriguez said. His voice cracked, raw. "Air support 5 minutes out. Hold if you can." 5 minutes, she exhaled. Looked at the belt. Did the math. She laid her weapon against the rocks, eyes narrowing on the ridgelines. The Taliban were massing. Clusters of fighters rushing. Forward, coordinated, disciplined. If they broke the line now, the convoy was finished. She opened fire, not in short bursts this time, but long, sweeping arcs. Brass clattered at her knees. Tracers ripped through the dawn air. Fighters dove for cover, their momentum broken. She walked her fire across the slopes, punishing every rise of a head, every muzzle flash. The barrel glowed cherry red, the heat radiated against her face. Her hands shook, her body screamed, but she didn't stop. 50 rounds left. 30, 10. And then the sound, the deep, thunderous chop of rotor blades. 2 Apaches swept over the ridgelines, Hellfire streaking down. Explosions tore the enemy positions apart. PKMs silenced, RPG teams vaporized, fighters scattered, cut down by gun. Runs that ripped the valley open. Maria slumped behind the rocks, her weapon smoking, her body trembling. She could barely hear Rodriguez's voice over the ringing in her ears. "Santis, what's your status?" She looked down the slope, at the convoy still intact, at the medics working over the wounded, but alive. She pressed her mic. Her voice cracked, but it was steady. Position secure, mission accomplished. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? The valley was quiet now. Too quiet. The Apaches circled overhead, their rotors thundering like vultures hovering over carrion. Smoke curled from the ridgelines, black scars where Hellfire missiles had found their targets. The ground stank of gunpowder and burnt rock. The echoes of combat lingered in the air, long after the last shot had been fired. Maria pushed herself to her feet. Every muscle screamed. Her hands trembled as she lifted the M249. The weapon's barrel glowing, too hot to touch. The smell of charred steel rising from it. She stumbled down the slope, boots sliding against loose rock, her legs unsteady from 2 hours of holding the line alone. The convoy below looked like a graveyard of twisted steel. Several Humvees were scarred, smoke curling from holes punched by RPGs. Medics moved quickly, their voices sharp, but controlled, working over the wounded in the dust between vehicles. Soldiers clutched bandaged limbs. Blood streaked the ground, but they were alive. That was the difference. Rodriguez was waiting at the base of the slope, his helmet pushed back, his face streaked with grime. His eyes widened when he saw her, weapon still smoking, uniform torn, a thin line of blood running down her cheek. Relief washed over his face, followed by something she'd never seen in him before, awe. Behind him, Captain Morrison stood stiff, his usual stern mask broken by something softer, relief, respect, maybe shame. Maria stopped in front of them, her chest heaving, her throat raw. She couldn't feel the weight of the $100 bill Rodriguez had once pressed into her palm. Now, the weight was different. "Santis," Rodriguez began, his voice low. He swallowed, like words were harder to find than bullets had been. "I've been in combat 15 years. 3 deployments. More firefights than I can count. I have never seen anything like what you just did." Morrison stepped forward, His tone lacked its usual edge. Staff Sergeant Santis. Higher headquarters monitored this fight. Radio traffic, Apache gun camera footage. They know exactly what you did here. There are going to be important people who want to hear your story. But Maria barely heard them. Her eyes had gone to the convoy, to the soldiers still standing, to the medics saving the wounded, to Private Thompson, the 19-year-old who had once bet against her, now helping load a bloodied Afghan soldier into a stretcher with steady hands. The whispers, the laughter, the bets, gone. She had proven herself, not just as a machine gunner, not as a woman trying to prove she belonged, but as the soldier who had kept 50 others alive when the valley had tried to swallow them whole. Casualties? She asked quietly. 7 wounded, Morrison replied. His eyes held hers. No dead. They'll all recover. Without you, half the company wouldn't be here. The words landed heavier than any round she'd fired. Her shoulders sagged. The truth of it settled in her chest like a stone. This wasn't about bets anymore. This wasn't about respect. It was about the promise soldiers make to each other, that they will bring one another home. When the evacuation helicopters arrived, the wounded were loaded aboard. Dust whipped across the valley floor as Maria leaned against the battered Humvee. Her weapon resting across her lap, soldiers approached her quietly, some shaking her hand, some clapping her shoulder, some just whispering "Thank you, Specialist Davis." The gunner whose weapon had jammed weeks before stood in front of her with tears in his eyes. Santis. My little girl back home is gonna have a father because of you. I don't know how to thank you for that. The words hit harder than shrapnel. She nodded once, unable to speak, her throat tight. The convoy's return to FOB coast was unlike anything she'd seen. Word had spread ahead of them. Soldiers lined the road as Bravo Company rolled through the gates. No mocking, no wages, just silence, then cheers. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the recognition pressing heavier than the M249 across her lap. She had done her job, nothing less, but to them, it was something else. That night, the debriefing took place in the command post. Maria sat at the long table, dust still in her hair, her uniform stiff with dried sweat and blood. Senior officers on video conference asked her for details. Fields of fire, target prioritization, rates of suppression. She spoke clinically, describing angles and timing, not emotions. Staff Sergeant Santis, one colonel said, his name tape reading Patterson. The Apache crews estimate you suppressed 15 enemy positions over a 2-hour period. Alone, you prevented what could have been catastrophic loss of American and Afghan lives. She stared at the table, her voice calm. I was just doing my job, sir. Patterson's voice cut sharper. No, you were doing everyone's job. The job of an entire weapons squad, alone, under impossible conditions. Maria said nothing. She didn't need to. 3 weeks later, the ceremony took place on the parade ground at Fob Coast. Under the blinding Afghan sun, Captain Morrison read the citation aloud. Maria stood at attention, the M249 at her side, sweat tracing lines down her neck. Soldiers filled the formation behind her, their faces shadowed under helmets, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, Morrison read. Staff Sergeant Maria Santis's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty resulted in the preservation of American and Afghan lives and reflects great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. The Silver Star gleamed. As it was pinned to her chest, applause rose like thunder, but Maria barely heard it. The words felt like they described someone else. Someone braver, someone stronger. The real recognition came later. In the dining hall, Rodriguez stood, his voice carrying across the crowded room. 3 months ago, some of us thought we knew what she was capable of. We were wrong, dead wrong. Today, every man in Bravo Company owes his life to Staff Sergeant Santis, and I want everyone here to remember something. Courage doesn't come in a particular size or shape. It comes from the heart. The applause was deafening. Soldiers slammed trays against tables. Others whistled, cheered, shouted her name. But Maria only washed their faces, and she saw something more important than medals, more important than ceremonies. She saw respect, genuine, earned. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, she sat alone, cleaning the M249 by lamplight. The weapon gleamed in her hands, every spring and pin polished with care. It wasn't just steel anymore. It was the burden she carried, the symbol of every doubt she had shattered, the weight of 50 lives she had held in her hands on a rocky rise in the middle of Afghanistan. Rodriguez found her there. He sat beside her in silence for a long time, watching her hands move. Finally, he spoke. "You know, when you first got here, I thought I had you figured out." He exhaled. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Maria didn't look up. "We all make assumptions, Sergeant. The important thing is being willing to change them when the evidence proves us wrong." Rodriguez nodded slowly. His voice softened. "You're not just another soldier now to them. You're something else." She paused, set down the bolt assembly, and met his gaze. "What am I?" He gave a small, tired smile. "You're a legend in legends. Carry responsibility." She looked back down at the weapon in her lap. Her reflection faint in the steel. A legend. The word didn't feel right in her mouth. But maybe legends weren't born from choice. Maybe they were forged in fire. And sometimes they were forged in silence. Why did the new soldiers look at her the same way the old ones once had? The helicopters landed with the same violence as always. Rotor wash whipping dust into choking clouds. Boots clattering onto gravel. Fresh uniforms pressed too clean for this place. Maria stood at the edge of the landing zone, watching them stumble off, their eyes wide and uncertain, their rifles hanging awkwardly at their sides. It reminded her of herself, not the hardened staff sergeant carrying a silver star on her chest, but the woman who had stepped off a helicopter months earlier to laughter and bets, the woman whose worth had been measured in clicks, not combat. Now, the new arrivals whispered the same doubts. "I heard that's her," one private muttered, nodding toward her, the one who held off the ambush in the valley. The other squinted, skeptical. "Her? She's tiny, 5'4", maybe. That weapon weighs more than 20 pounds. No way she carried it through a firefight like that." Maria didn't correct them. She just watched, letting their words drift like dust in the wind. She remembered the sting of those same whispers, remembered the fire it had lit inside her. Later that day, on the range, she strapped the M249 across her back and called the soldiers into formation. Their eyes were wide, half reverent, half doubtful. She recognized the look, respect for the story, suspicion of the truth. "You gentlemen have questions about this weapon?" she asked, her voice even. The skeptical private cleared his throat. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but it's just heavy. Hard to believe someone your size could really." She unslung the M249 in one motion. Holding it out, "Take it," she said. He hesitated, then gripped the weapon. His arms sagged almost instantly. He shifted it awkwardly, trying to balance the weight. "It's heavy," he admitted. Maria nodded. "It is. But weight doesn't matter in combat. What matters is training, discipline, willingness to do whatever it takes to bring your brothers home. The weapon doesn't care how big you are. It only cares whether you know how to use it." She took it back, the motion smooth, effortless. Then she dropped to the dirt, shouldered the weapon, and fired a controlled burst into the target downrange. Dust exploded in a tight circle around the silhouette's chest. The new soldiers went silent. Their doubt cracked. Just a little, she walked them through firing positions, teaching them to brace against recoil, to conserve ammunition, to fire in short bursts instead of spraying blindly. More soldiers drifted over, drawn by the sound of her voice, by the calm authority in it. by the fact that every word came not from fire. Remember, she said at the end, courage isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about standing up when others need you to stand, regardless of the odds. That's something any soldier can do, if they're willing to pay the price. The soldiers nodded, their faces thoughtful, no longer skeptical. She saw herself in their eyes, not the doubted newcomer anymore, but something different, something she hadn't expected to become. A mentor. That night, she sat alone in the armory, cleaning the M249 as she always did. The weapon gleamed in the lamplight, every pin and spring wiped clean. It had been mocked once, called a pig, dead weight, something she couldn't carry. Now it was something else entirely. It was the burden she had chosen, the tool she had mastered. Rodriguez found her there. He had been promoted to sergeant first class, preparing to rotate home. His steps were slow, tired. As he dropped into the chair beside her workbench, "You know," he said, his voice low, "when you first got here, I thought I had you figured out." He gave a dry laugh. "Turns out, I was wrong about a lot of things." Maria kept working, sliding a brush through the chamber. "We all make assumptions, Sergeant. The important thing is being willing to change them when the evidence proves us wrong." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned back, arms crossed. "The new soldiers. They look at you differently than we did. To them, you're not a woman trying to prove she can do a man's job. You're just a soldier who's proven she can do the job. Period." Maria smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted to be." Rodriguez shook his head. "You're more than that now. You're a legend. And legends carry a responsibility to the ones who come after, to make sure they know what this really costs." Maria looked down at the weapon in her lap, a reflection faint in the steel. A legend. The word still felt strange. She wasn't sure she believed it. She wasn't sure she wanted it. But when she thought of the fresh faces she'd seen that morning, the wide eyes, the nervous hands, the whispered doubts, she understood. Her story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to them, because one day, the valley would open again. The ridges would fill with fire. The world would collapse into smoke and bullets. And those young soldiers would need to remember that courage isn't about size or weight. It's about standing up when everyone else needs you to. She set the weapon down, her hand steady now. The silver star pinned to her uniform gleamed under the dim light, but her eyes were on the steel in front of her. The M249 that had once been a burden. The M249 that had once been a bet. The M249 that had carried 50 lives through fire. She whispered to herself, too quiet for Rodriguez to hear. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that silence, she understood. Her battles weren't over, but her purpose had just begun. Why did silence feel heavier after victory than during battle? Nights on the fob stretched longer now. The gunfire, the missions, the adrenaline, those came in bursts. But the hours afterward, when the desert turned cold and the walls pressed in, those lasted forever. Maria sat on her bunk, boots still on, her weapon propped against the wall like a shadow that refused to leave. Outside, soldiers laughed in the common area, played cards, traded jokes. Inside, she traced the scar across her cheek with her fingertips. Shrapnel, a reminder. She thought about the valley, not the firefight. She remembered that with clinical detail, like a sequence of tasks. Target, suppress, reload. What lingered were the faces. The ones who had looked to her, pinned down, waiting for her to hold the line. The ones who had survived because she didn't stop firing. 50 lives, she carried them all now. When she walked through the FOB, soldiers moved aside. Some saluted sharper. Some whispered her name as she passed. Others clapped her shoulder with the weight of gratitude. She hated it. Not the respect, not the brotherhood, but the silence that followed. The silence of expectation, as if she were more than human. Now, as if she were untouchable, a legend. Rodriguez's words echoed in her mind. Legends carry responsibility, but what he hadn't said, what no one said, was how heavy responsibility felt in the dark. When there was no enemy, no mission, just the echo of your own thoughts, she carried the respect of her brothers. She carried the whispers of her doubters, silenced now but never forgotten. And she carried the truth that one day she might not come back. That night, the dreams came again. She was back on the ridge. The M249 screamed in her hands, the barrel glowing red, the air thick with smoke. Fighters swarmed down the slopes, endless. Faceless, she fired until the belt ran dry, reached for another, and found nothing. Her weapon clicked empty. The valley roared with silence. The convoy below turned its faces up to her, eyes wide, waiting, and she had nothing left to give. She woke with a gasp, sweat clinging to her back, hands trembling. Morning came like punishment. She strapped the M249 across her shoulder and made her way to the range. Training new soldiers had become her routine. She showed them firing positions, walked them through malfunctions, made them repeat drills until their hands remembered what their heads forgot. But some mornings, she could feel the mask slipping, the doubt under the armor, the tremor in her hands when she cleaned the weapon too long, too carefully. The soldiers didn't notice, or maybe they didn't want to them. She was the woman who had silenced 15 enemy positions. The soldier who had carried a company through fire. The one whose story they whispered at night like folklore. Legends weren't allowed to falter. Rodriguez found her again one evening in the armory. She was staring at the weapon on the table, the lamplight gleaming against its steel. "You ever think about what it cost?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. Every day. He sat beside her, his elbows on his knees. "You saved lives, but I can see it in your eyes, Santos. You wonder if you lost something too." She finally met his gaze. "They don't see me anymore. They see the story, the woman with the big gun, the one who stood alone. I'm not sure I recognize myself in that story." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's war. It writes stories about us we didn't ask for. Stories bigger than the truth." He paused, then added, "But the soldiers who follow those stories, they fight harder because of them." Maria exhaled. "So I'm supposed to be both? The soldier and the story?" "Exactly." She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Legends don't get to be tired." Rodriguez's eyes softened. "Maybe not, but soldiers do. And you're still allowed to be one of those." For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet clink of her brush against steel. Finally, she set the weapon down, her hands still. "I'm afraid of failing them," she whispered. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "We all are." The words settled. Like a weight lifted. Fear wasn't weakness, it was truth. And maybe, just maybe, that truth was what kept her sharp. The weeks rolled on. Missions came and went. Some were routine patrols, others sharp bursts of chaos that ended too quickly to register. Each time, Maria carried the M249 with the same steadiness, the same focus. Her squad followed her lead without question now. Even Williams, once her harshest critic, fought beside her with unspoken trust. But at night, when the lights dimmed, she still heard the echoes. The silence of the valley, the silence of expectation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky in fire, Maria walked the perimeter alone. The FOB's walls stretched behind her, but her eyes were on the mountains beyond. Somewhere out there, another ambush waited. Another valley, another test. She knew she would face it, not because she wanted to, not because she believed in legends, but because soldiers didn't get to choose when the fire came. The choice was only this: stand or fall. She paused, resting her hand against the M249 slung across her back. The weight was familiar now. Not just steel, not just burden. It was her answer. She whispered into the dusk, a voice too soft for anyone to hear. "When they need me, I'll be ready." The Mountains gave no reply, only silence. But in that silence, she found something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not doubt, resolve. Why did the briefing room feel colder than the mountains outside? October 15th, another stack of aerial photographs laid flat across the table. Another operation that, on paper, looked routine. Captain Morrison tapped his finger on the topographic map, his voice clipped, businesslike. Reports of Taliban planting IEDs along Route Copper. 3 strikes in the last week, more sophisticated each time. Intel suggests this valley is their staging ground. Maria leaned forward, her eyes scanning the terrain. A natural corridor, 2 kilometers long, narrow, steep ridges on both sides. Dead space, classic ambush country. Rodriguez frowned. Sir, this terrain is perfect for an ambush. If they've got fighters on those ridgelines, that's why we're going in heavy. Morrison cut him off. Full company, NA support. Air cover on standby. Artillery at FOB Chapman. This is a show of force. We clear it. We send a message. Maria's eyes stayed fixed on the map. Too perfect. Too obvious. She had learned the hard way that the enemy wasn't careless. If the valley was obvious to them, it was obvious to the Taliban too, which meant it wasn't just a staging ground. What's the source of this intel? She asked. Morrison's gaze flicked up, irritation sharp. Classified. Execute the mission. Staff Sergeant. The conversation ended, but the doubt didn't. At dawn, the convoy rolled out, engines rumbling, soldiers tense. Maria rode in the lead Humvee, her M249 mounted and ready, scanning the ridges with wary eyes. The valley swallowed them whole. For the first kilometer, nothing. Silence. Too much silence. Not a shepherd, not a farmer, not a goat on the slopes. Maria's chest tightened. Civilians avoided danger, and this valley was empty. She leaned down. Rodriguez. No locals. Not one. He nodded grimly. He'd seen it too. The first RPG slammed into the third vehicle. The blast shook the earth. Before the echo died, the valley erupted. Machine guns, sniper fire, RPGs screaming from both ridges. Fighters silhouetted against the ridgelines, positioned in interlocking fields of fire. The convoy was caught in the jaws of a trap. Rodriguez's voice roared through the radio. Ambush. Multiple contacts. Both sides. The valley turned into hell. Bullets raked the vehicles. Snipers pinned soldiers behind thin cover. RPGs hammered the column. Within 10 minutes, the weapons team was gone. Their vehicle obliterated. There. Heavy machine guns silenced. Afghan soldiers fell in the open. Bodies torn into the dust. Morrison's voice cracked through the comms, barely audible over the roar. All stations, this is Bravo 6. Company-sized element. Request immediate air support. TOC's reply was cold, merciless. Air support 30 minutes out, artillery danger close. Negative clearance. 30 minutes. The valley would be a graveyard in 10. Maria scanned the ridges. Fighters were already moving down the slopes. Bounding forward, rifles flashing. The convoy was boxed in by rock slides. No retreat. No escape. Her stomach clenched. She knew what this was, a deliberate killing ground. And then, that small rise 50 meters north, exposed, deadly. The only place with a line of sight on both ridgelines. Her throat went dry. The same calculation she had made before, the same impossible choice. Rodriguez, she called. I need that rise. From there I can suppress both slopes. Negative. Santis, his voice cracked. Too exposed. Stay in your vehicle. But she was already moving. She vaulted from the Humvee. M249 slung tight. Belts of ammunition draped across her shoulders like chains. Bullets snapped past. Dust exploded at her feet. An RPG screamed overhead, detonating behind her in a thunderous boom that rattled her bones. She hit the rise, dropped into position. slammed the bipod into the dirt. All stations. She keyed her mic, her voice steady despite the firestorm. This is Santes. I have eyes on both ridgelines. Beginning suppressive fire. The M249 roared. Her first burst cut down a fighter. Sprinting along the western slope, the second ripped through a PKM nest. Sparks flying as the weapon fell silent. She shifted left to right, walking fire across muzzle flashes, forcing fighters into cover. For a moment, the valley staggered. Then the enemy turned on her. Every weapon, every rifle, every sniper. The rocks around her shattered under impacts. Bullets shrieked past her ears. An RPG slammed into the slope 10 feet away, the blast hurling her flat. Shrapnel tore a gash across her cheek. Her ears rang, blood dripping down her jaw. She forced herself upright, reloaded, fired again. Status? Rodriguez's voice strained through the static. Suppressing 15+ positions. RPG team neutralized, holding. Her hands moved with brutal rhythm. Fire. Reload. Fire again. The barrel glowed cherry red, heat radiating against her face. Brass casings piled at her knees. Her gloves smoked from friction, but the fighters kept coming. Closer. Closer. Grenades arced down toward the convoy. Explosions ripped the valley floor. Medics shouted for tourniquets, for stretchers. Soldiers screamed into the dust. Rodriguez's voice cracked. Santes, we need the snipers suppressed. Medics can't move. She spotted the flashes. 3 positions. She shifted, burst after burst, forcing the marksman down. Her last belt rattled into place. 200 rounds, all stations, she whispered, breath ragged. Final belt. They're massing for a push. Copy. Air support 5 minutes out. Hold if you can. 5 minutes. She exhaled. Did the math. Each burst had to matter. Each round had to buy seconds. The fighters surged, dozens at once, charging down the slopes. Rifles blazing, Maria opened fire. Sweeping arcs that tore through the charge. Dust exploded, men dropped. Others dove for cover. Her weapon screamed. The barrel glowed white-hot. Her body trembled. Her throat burned with every breath. 50 rounds left, 30, 10. And then, salvation. The heavy chop of rotor blades. 2 Apaches roared over the ridges. Hellfire streaking down. Explosions lit the valley. Fire tearing enemy positions apart. PKM silenced, RPG teams annihilated. Fighters scattered. Cut down by gun runs. Maria slumped behind her weapon, trembling, smoke rising around her. She could barely hear Rodriguez's voice through the ringing in her ears. Santes, what's your status? She looked at the convoy. Below, battered, scarred, bloodied, but alive. Her voice cracked, but it was steady. Position secure. Mission accomplished. Why did the hardest part come after the battle was won? The valley was behind them. The smoke had cleared. The wounded had been evacuated. Their stretchers lifted into the belly of helicopters that vanished into the horizon. Bravo Company returned to Fob Coast in battered Humvees. Silence hanging in the convoy like a shadow. But when they rolled through the gates, the silence broke. Soldiers lined the route, faces pale, eyes wide. They had already heard. Word traveled faster than convoys in war zones. Some saluted. Others clapped their rifles against their armor. A few whispered her name, Santes, in the motor pool. Captain Morrison and Rodriguez waited, their uniforms torn, faces grim. Maria climbed down from the Humvee. Her M249 still slung across her shoulder, smoke rising faintly from its overheated barrel. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice low. 7 wounded, no dead. Every one of them is going home because of you. Morrison's tone was sharper, but it carried something else this time, respect. Staff Sergeant. Headquarters monitored everything. Radio traffic, Apache gun cams. They know what you did. Maria didn't answer. Her eyes had drifted to the soldiers unloading gear, private. Thompson, Once the boy who'd placed money against her was now steady, purposeful, helping medics carry supplies. Corporal Williams, her loudest critic, was pale, hands trembling as he secured equipment, but alive. Alive because of her. The weight settled heavier than the weapon on her shoulder. Later, in the debriefing room, senior officers asked her to recount the firefight. She spoke clinically. Ridgeline, suppression, rate of fire, target selection. Not about fear. Not about the moment she thought she wouldn't have enough rounds. Not about the ringing silence after the last belt ran dry. Staff Sergeant, a colonel said over video conference, "You provided suppressive fire equivalent to an entire weapon squad. Alone, you prevented catastrophic loss of life. That will be remembered." She sat silent, remembered. The word carried as much weight as the medal they would soon pin on her chest. 3 weeks later, under the harsh Afghan sun, Maria stood on the parade ground as Captain Morrison read the citation for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy. The silver star gleamed on her uniform. Applause thundered, soldiers cheered. But Maria's eyes were fixed straight ahead, her body still. The medal was weightless compared to the memory of bullets snapping past her head, the smell of blood. In the dust, the sound of 50 lives waiting for her not to falter. That night, in the dining hall, Rodriguez stood and called for silence. His voice carried across the room, rough but steady. 3 months ago, some of us thought we knew what she could or couldn't do. We were wrong, dead wrong. Today, every man in Bravo Company owes his life to Staff Sergeant Santis. And I want you to remember something. Courage doesn't come in a size. It doesn't come in a shape. It comes from the heart. The applause that followed was deafening, but Maria noticed something quieter. The faces, no longer doubting, no longer whispering, only respect. 6 months later, her deployment neared its end. Helicopters carried fresh soldiers into Fob Coast. Their uniforms crisp, their eyes wide, Maria trained them on the range, teaching firing positions, showing them how to carry the M249 without letting it break their backs. One morning, she overheard 2 new arrivals whispering, "I heard she's the one who saved the whole company in that valley." Her? No way. She's too small to carry that thing. Maria smiled to herself. She remembered when the same words had been said about her. She approached, the weapon slung casually across her shoulder. "You have questions about this?" she asked. The soldier looked embarrassed but nodded. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but it just doesn't make sense." She handed him the weapon. "Take it. Feel the weight." He nearly dropped it. "It's heavy," he admitted. "It is," she said. "But weight isn't what matters. Training, discipline, the willingness to do whatever it takes to bring your brothers home. That's what matters. The weapon doesn't care how big you are, only that you know how to use it." The soldiers listened, rapt. Others gathered around. They didn't see a woman carrying steel anymore. They saw a soldier who had proven herself in the fire. Later, in the armory, Rodriguez found her cleaning the weapon again, every pin and spring gleaming. He was days away from going home. "You know," he said, settling into a chair beside her, "those kids don't see you like we did. To them, you're not a woman trying to prove she belongs. You're just a soldier who already did." Maria didn't look up. "That's all I ever wanted." Rodriguez gave a tired smile. "Well, you're more than that now. You're a legend, and legends carry responsibility." She paused, her hands still on the weapon. A legend. The word still didn't fit. She wasn't sure it ever would. But she thought of those young soldiers, of the day the ridges would open again, when bullets would rain down and the world would shrink to a single decision. And she knew. Her story wasn't about medals. It wasn't about bets. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about what soldiers owe each other. The promise to stand when everyone else needs you to. That night, alone in the armory, Maria placed the M249 on the table. She looked at it for a long time, the steel reflecting the dim light. The weapon that had once been a burden. The weapon that had once been a bet. The weapon that had once held the weight of 50 lives. Her hand brushed over it gently, almost like a farewell. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that silence, Maria Santis understood. She hadn't just carried the weight of a weapon. She had carried the weight of trust, of lives, of a promise kept in the fire. And that, she knew, would matter long after the last bullet was fired.